أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So as I mentioned, my name is Hira Khanzada. I'm a mental health therapist. Thank you for tuning in today. Today we're going to be talking about a really important topic, trauma. And this topic really is dear to my heart because it affects all of us. It affects most of us. And so today we're really going to be doing an introduction to healing from trauma and how to make growth out of our losses. And so we'll jump right on in. We'll start with an intention. They say that energy flows where intention goes. And so set your intention for today, whether it's for healing, rebuilding, finding yourself, finding God, whatever that intention is for today's hour. Just orient yourself. And now we'll move into something really important when it comes to trauma. As we do in trauma therapy, what we're going to do today is be very mindful that trauma is a heavy topic and it can be triggering for a lot of us. And so, the same way we do in trauma therapy, we're going to do here. Before we even touch the trauma, we make sure that we have a safe space to go to if the trauma gets overwhelming, as trauma does. A safe space within, a safe person, a way to come back to the present moment, a safe memory. So just kind of orient yourself to having a place to go or something to do if you find yourself being triggered or flooded in this presentation. So just a reminder for that. And no worries, you won't miss the presentation. It's being recorded. You can always come back. And so kind of here are some kind of coping skills that we can keep in mind. Self-soothing, hugging yourself, tapping into your five senses, maybe doing a healthy distraction, right? Being mindful of what's coming up, or taking a break and talking to a friend, calling a hotline if you find yourself being triggered today. So let's really jump into our topic. We have, less than an hour, and so I'm going to try to pack in a lot for you guys in a very limited time. So our focus today is really going to be 3 steps. One is understanding trauma. The second step will be healing through trauma. And the last one, I know many of you might be here to support a loved one through trauma. And so we're going to go through all 3 of these topics. The first one, I'd say, maybe even being the most important, because once we understand the impact of the trauma, then we can go through the trauma and heal. So what is trauma? Trauma is perceived exposure to risk of death, violence, or loss of bodily integrity. Okay, essentially, trauma is a loss of safety and control. Now, what may be traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person. Do we know why? That question is not important, right? What's important is the impact that it has on each and every individual person. And so what are some common traumas? Physical abuse or assault, sexual abuse or assault, or any violation, any sexual violation, psychological abuse, accidents. You can see the list here. Sudden loss of home and belongings can be a major trauma, right? War, terrorism, the refugee crisis, traumatic loss, losing someone that you love very suddenly is very traumatic. And then 2 that often get neglected as traumas are abandonment and neglect. These are very, very heavy traumas, and they have a deep impact on us. Now, there's a lot of other traumas that are not mentioned here, but these are some of the really common ones that kind of span for all of us. Now, understanding also includes the types of traumas, okay? So traumas aren't linear, right? There's interpersonal trauma, person to person, right? Somebody hurt me. Then there's intergenerational trauma, right? Where the trauma goes through families. There's community trauma, community violence, right? Prejudice, anti-Muslim prejudice is a form of trauma, right? There's childhood traumas, and then there's complex traumas. And I want to say a special comment about that. That's when we have a lot of compounded traumas that, you know, trauma after trauma, right? Where the traumas is now no longer one event, right? Or one experience, but it's been compounded, right? With, say, childhood neglect, and then a natural disaster, at the age of 11 or 12, followed by traumatic losses throughout the teen years, then followed by a sexual assault and physical assaults. And, what's interesting about complex trauma is that oftentimes trauma begets trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so the impacts of trauma are vast. They impact our thinking, our emotions, our physical body. Trauma impacts our health, our immune system, right? It impacts our behavior and our relationships. So trauma really leaves no one. It really expands and impacts almost every area of a lot of people's lives. And so the impact on emotions and mood, I didn't want to get too clinical. I wanted to kind of say these in layman's terms. But a lot of these are simple ways of talking about trauma symptoms, right? So, really common emotions of trauma are strong fear, anger, right? Anger at the person that did this to me, anger at God, even. Why did you do this to me, God? Right? Depression, shame, blame, guilt. Oftentimes with trauma, there's a lot of self-blame. It's my fault. I should have, I should have done something differently. Should have, could have, and I would have, right? And with trauma, something really important to recognize is that there's also mood swings, right? As is the nature of trauma, right? It is not stable. It is not safe. And what happens oftentimes with trauma in the mood is that um, we'll go from 0 to 100, right, in terms of getting triggered. So something reminds me of a trauma, or, you know, my regulation of my emotions, you know, I'm not feeling safe enough to do that, right? So mood swings are very common with trauma. And there's also something I want to mention called dissociation. So that's this feeling when you feel numb, right? You feel disconnected from yourself, you feel disconnected from reality. I know uh, one woman, she had a lot of childhood trauma, and she came to me one day and she told me, "Man, I look in the mirror and I don't know who I'm looking at sometimes." She's like, "Most of the times I'm fine, but out of nowhere, I look in the mirror and I'm like, who is that?" Right? So that's dissociation, and it's actually a symptom of trauma. It's a very normal symptom of trauma. Trauma also impacts our thoughts, right? So why me, right? I wish I could trust people, but I can't. A very common thought in a lot of traumas is I should have died. Why am I still alive? Right? Leave me alone. I cannot even think, let alone do anything. And all of these thoughts also go to impact our relationships, right? Especially if you've been a victim of interpersonal trauma. Trust is huge, right? Impaired trust, no longer being able to trust people, being afraid of intimacy, right? Meaningful relationships. And we may consciously not even know that we're afraid, right? But our behaviors will actually distance us from intimacy or meaningful relationships, right? And those behaviors often go misunderstood because our society doesn't have a trauma informed perspective, right? So we may be doing something like, oh gosh, like, why can't I hold a stable relationship, right? Or why are all the men that I date, you know, why are they womanizers, right? Or why are all the women I date, they take advantage of me and they don't value me, right? Um, Oftentimes the answer can go back to a trauma. And the good news is that once we know what it is, we can begin healing, right? But this is one of the impacts, feeling alone. And I will mention I wrote on the slide here, unrealistic expectations. Now, I want to be careful mentioning this because a lot of our expectations of people come from underlying needs that have not been met. And oftentimes we'll find that with trauma, you know, many of us really, really hope um, that people can meet an ideal for us, or we really hope that somebody will be that protector for us. And we're sorely and gravely disappointed when that does not come to fruition, right? And so this can be one of the impacts of trauma. Also, our behavior, right? So this is oftentimes one of the easiest things to recognize with trauma, right? So there's a lot of avoidance with trauma, right? Avoiding certain places, avoiding certain things, right? Addictions, dependencies, right? Oftentimes people might think that, oh, you're just addicted and it's biochemical. And yes, eventually it becomes biochemical, but oftentimes we're seeking safety, right? In substances and different things. And really what we're trying to do is we're trying to escape the pain, right? We're trying to escape painful emotions and just be okay, you know. um, I know one young man, he is dependent on marijuana, and his parents and his family look at him and they think, gosh, he's just a stoner, he can't get his life together, he can't do anything. And when we sat and talked, he told me, he was like, look, if I don't smoke weed, i I'm going to be having panic attacks all day, right? He's like, I hate this because I can't meet my goals in life, but I don't see a way out. If I don't do this, things are going to fall apart, right? And so really compassionately understanding that a lot of addictions stem from an inability and a difficulty to manage what's coming up, right? And it's unfortunate because we end up having to take responsibility for something that we had no control over, right? This thing happened to us. We went through this thing, and yet here we are, picking up the pieces and trying to survive when we don't know how, right? And oftentimes this comes out in our behaviors, right? So risk taking, impulses, or being overly cautious, right? Overly afraid of something happening again, right? And something important I want to note is that there's a freeze response that also comes with trauma. There's fight, there's flight, and then there's freeze, right? And so you'll often see an inability to act or moving forward with our goals. And this is really common. And so something, really important to me when it comes to trauma is shifts in our beliefs, right? And so trauma has this way of kind of resetting our brain. It's really biological, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But trauma oftentimes shifts our beliefs about ourselves, about other people, about the world, and even about God, right? Or our system of making meaning about the world, right? So oftentimes someone may feel safe in the world, and after a series of traumas, they'll believe the world isn't safe anymore, right? Or if a child has grown up, being abused, sexually abused, taken advantage of at a young age, when a child, doesn't have the power to protect themselves, right? They'll grow up with the belief that no one can be trusted, right? And many of us who are traumatized, we may think, I'm broken, I'm dirty now. And some of us may even think God hates me. I asked a young man the other day, are you going to go to heaven or hell? I just was wondering. And he kind of paused and he said, oh, I'm going to go to heaven. His voice was really high pitched. And I said, right, you think you're going to go to heaven? And he's like, actually, I think I'm going to go to hell. And we dug deeper, and underneath that was really a sense that, he didn't believe he was good. He didn't believe he was good enough. He felt God hated him, right? And so the shifts in our beliefs are very, very real. And oftentimes with trauma, right, those of us who've been traumatized will, these beliefs are safety mechanisms, right? They're there to protect us in a world that has not been safe for us, right? But eventually, once the trauma has subsided, right, or or once we're in the present moment and the trauma is behind us, these beliefs are no longer functional and they end up isolating us, ripping us of our joy, right? And what I like to call these beliefs are is stuck beliefs, right? They're not necessarily always accurate, right? Um, and we want to come to balance, and that's a really difficult process. But these are shifts in core beliefs that truly do happen. They can impact our faith and every avenue of life. Now, I want to really briefly touch on the brain. Okay, so as you can see here, there's a beautiful diagram of the brain. And if you're not looking at the screen, I'll just kind of describe it to you. I want you to think about the front of your forehead. Okay, so behind that front of your forehead, it's this part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex. Okay, and then right in the middle of your brain, if you were to kind of open it up and look at that middle piece, there's this section called the limbic system. Okay. And the limbic system is kind of our very primal brain. And within that limbic system, there's this place called the HPA axis. And what's really in that center of the brain there is this little almond shaped um, part of our brain called the amygdala, and this is the fear center of the brain. Okay, so anytime you feel very strong fear and emotions, you can bet your amygdala is super activated. And near that amygdala is this part of your brain called the hippocampus, right? And the hippocampus is the part of your brain. One of its functions is dealing with memory. Okay, so I always like to say if there was a hippo on campus, you'd remember it, right? So this is the memory part of your brain. And what happens in trauma is that these parts of the brain are so overwhelmed, right? Imagine looking at like a screen and you're seeing where all the blood and all the energy is going. They are going towards that middle limbic system of your brain, okay? And that part of your brain gets so overwhelmed um, that memories and beliefs and neurological shifts happen very quickly, right? And so we mentioned going from 0 to 100. Trauma has a way of really shifting our emotional framework, shifting the way we experience emotions, and the way our survival fight or flight response gets activated. And that prefrontal cortex that we talked about, that part of the brain's actually our reasoning and logic part, decision making part. And you'll find that when the amygdala is overactivated, the prefrontal cortex is pretty much no longer in use, right? So now we have that fear part of our brain pretty much driving us, our behavior, our thoughts, our emotions, and that logic reasoning part isn't. And this is for good reason, right? If you have a saber-toothed tiger in front of you, or you have a threat in front of you, or someone is after you, you want to bet you want that amygdala and that hippocampus in charge, right? You want that limbic system part of your brain to not think about, oh, are my shoes on? Do I have my keys in my hand? You want to run, right? Or you want to fight, flight, or do whatever needs to be done. But what ends up happening with trauma is that this part gets turned on chronically for a lot of us. Okay, and understanding that really helps us understand that trauma is very biological, and there is a way to work with the brain once we know what's going on. And so that fight, flight, or freeze response we were talking about, it's really when that body goes into survival mode, right? Adrenaline, cortisol, these stress hormones are released, and our fear is leading us, right? And so when that fight, flight, or freeze response is on, right, we have a response in our body. The heart beats faster, the stomach, you might get nauseous, digestion slows down, your muscles become more tense, right? Because they might be ready to fight, you know. You're deep breathing, or you're quickly breathing rather. Your blood pressure increases because you're either ready to run, right? And so your body is getting ready for this threat. And something that I actually didn't mention earlier is there's a difference between certain types of trauma, and kind of in the world of trauma, we call traumas little t traumas and big T traumas. So little t traumas are traumas that are everyday stressors, right? Um, and they may not necessarily on the surface look like, we're fearing risk of our life or our bodily integrity, but over time, they're quite traumatic, right? And so this could be something like a divorce, right? Or like the death of a very close loved one. right? Even if it wasn't sudden, right? That can be very traumatic, losing someone very close to you. And big T traumas, right, are the ones we talked about earlier, where you really see that pronounced response, and there's a element of safety and risk for the body, right? Or we perceive that too. That can count as a big T trauma. And so, why I mention that is that our fight, flight, or freeze response turns on for both, for any stressor, really. And when we're in a chronic state of stress, we'll notice that this system directs our body's attention to survival and not necessarily to long term immune function, digestion, resting, right? And so you're constantly wired and tired eventually, right? And from there, I really want to mention an important point that is huge in trauma is that trauma gets stored in the body, right? So oftentimes in our society, we're living in our heads, right? You know, we have memories of the trauma, we have thoughts of the trauma, but the body actually has its own memory. And, you know, in the Islamic tradition, I always think of the Day of Judgment, how our limbs are going to speak for us, right? Our tongue is going to speak for us. So our limbs, you know, at a spiritual level have this memory, and subhanAllah, biologically, they have a memory too, right? And oftentimes there will be trauma survivors who can't remember what happened, right? Or later into their life, in their 20s or 30s, they'll start remembering of a trauma that happened when they were a child, right? And this is because the body has a memory, right? And you know, I want to mention an important point here. An example from nature is that, you know, when you look at animals, right, you'll see in nature that a lot of animals aren't traumatized the way humans get. And it's curious, you know, you wonder why. And what you see is, you know, let's envision an example in our mind of a cheetah chasing an elk. I don't know if those are from the same environment, but let's just do that for the sake of, you know. So a cheetah's chasing an elk, and you know, the elk is running, 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 running. It's going into that fight or flight response we talked about. And say that the cheetah catches the elk and is biting at its neck. And, you know, the elk now has gotten into freeze mode, right? Because it can't fight, it can't flight. So it's just frozen, right? It's playing dead, right? And this is a very automatic response, by the way. We can't choose whether we fight, flight, or freeze necessarily in the moment. Our body makes that choice for us, right? And our body's doing the best it can in very unusual, frightening, traumatic circumstances. So the elk is now in freeze mode. So the cheetah is kind of gnawing at the neck of the elk, and something comes along, and you know, maybe like a safari comes along, and the cheetah gets distracted, or something else comes along, and you know, the elk kind of stays frozen, the cheetah runs away, and then what you'll actually see in nature with the elk that remains is that it'll go through certain body movements that, you know, shake off the trauma. It'll shake it off, it'll almost do a dance, and the next thing you know, it'll a few moments later, it'll go back to its regular life and carry on, and as if nothing happened. But the difference, right, between the elk and a lot of us is that what the elk did in that moment is it released the trauma from its body. The elk went through certain physical movements, certain kind of natural contractions that came out of the elk to release that trauma. And in our society, what often ends up happening is that we are a society that's very often in freeze mode. We, we become frozen by our traumas. We don't know what to do. We end up going inward, and oftentimes the body is the first thing to shut down, right? And so trauma truly, truly gets stored in the body. And an example that I wanted to give, and there's actually a lot of research on this, is pelvic pain for survivors of sexual trauma in childhood. And many women, in some of these studies, did not even know that they had been through this trauma, right? But once they were in a relationship, in an intimate relationship, or once they were giving childbirth, suddenly that trauma came back, and the body remembered, right? Because that same part of their body, right, was now being threatened, right, or now being invaded upon. And so the body really remembers, and oftentimes people, they fight with their body. They begin to hate their body. Body, why can't you, you know, why can't you comply? Why can't you, you know, work with me here, right? But really, what your body is trying to do is it's trying to protect itself because of what happened. Your body is doing the best it can. And we'll talk a little bit about healing, about releasing trauma from a body in a very safe way. And as we talk about healing, as we segue into this part of the presentation, I want everyone to kind of just think about your vision of healing, right? So, what would your life be like right now if you weren't dealing with this trauma? What would you be doing? In what ways would your world be bigger? Would you be more free, right? Would the world be different? Um, right? What would be different about your life, and what would be the same, right? So think about a vision of what you'd really be doing if you weren't dealing with this trauma, right? And we'll take that vision and carry it forward into talking about recovery. So Judith Herman, she has written a seminal work on trauma called Trauma and Recovery. And she's outlined the three stages of trauma recovery. And the first one is safety and stabilization. After that, we go into remembrance and mourning of the losses of the trauma. And lastly, right, we establish reconnection. Now, this is a very linear process, right? I mentioned earlier complex trauma, right, or chronic trauma. This process is difficult with chronic trauma. This process is difficult with any trauma, right? But we also want to recognize and honor that not every trauma can work on this linear format. And yet these steps can help us heal through any trauma, right? We may remain in safety and stabilization for a very long time. And that may be just what we need to function and to live a life and to move forward with our goals. And so stabilization, as you can imagine, starts with the basics, right? Especially after in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, right? We go back to food, water, shelter, the basic needs of your body, right? And safe social support, safe people if there are any, right? A friend, a therapist, a family member, oftentimes a support group. There's a lot of trauma support groups in a lot of different areas in the country, right? Others who have been through similar atrocities, right? Coming together, just stabilizing and having basic resources is essential in the beginning of a trauma, right? Making sure you're hydrated. And part of stabilization is turning on the rest and digest response. So we talked about fight, flight, or freeze, right? But in the opposite, there's a relaxation response in our body, the parasympathetic response. And we like to call that the rest and digest, right? And so that response is basically turned on when we feel safe in our environment or when there's different things going on in our environment to allow us to rest, right? And in trauma, right, we want to turn on that rest and digest response, but oftentimes there's this great need, right, to go back to the trauma. And oftentimes, trauma, many people re experience it, they relive it, they can't get it off their mind, right? So it's not as easy as just turning on the rest and digest response. And that's why, we like to envision the continuum of an infinity symbol here, where, we will touch the trauma, right, at times to heal from it. And then we will retreat back to safety at signs of distress, right? Because we don't want to re traumatize. Remembering a trauma again can be very re-traumatizing, right? Feeling all those emotions, reliving it, re-experiencing it, right, can be very, very re-traumatizing. And so once those things come up, we want to go back and turn on the rest and digest response, right? To allow our body to heal. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move forward. And part of stabilization is also relaxation tools. Okay. And so the relaxation tools, I've listed some here, are deep breathing, grounding with our five senses, progressive muscle relaxation. You can look it up online. Trauma sensitive yoga practice. That was started by Dr. Van der Kolk. He's a leading researcher and writer on trauma. A soothing shower or bath, and even herbal supports, right? Like lavender, chamomile, things that really down-regulate the system. And don't give this little credit, because these things are very, very essential for healing. The body has been through so much. It has gone through essentially the heightened response of, you know, not knowing whether we will survive. And it's absolutely important to nurture and heal the body, and almost baby it, right, as it comes back to stabilization. Another thing that I want to mention is moving through the trauma. And so we can see the picture there of the cheetah and that animal that it's chasing. What we really want to do in the stabilization phase, not necessarily working through the trauma, but being very mindful, right? Listening to the body sensations, right? And doing what needs to be done, right? Oftentimes, part of stabilization may be, changing your phone number or cutting people off, cutting someone off who's done something very terrible to you, at least temporarily, right? Stabilization is really listening to the body and listening to sensations and coming to a place of safety, right? We'll talk a little bit more about moving through the trauma shortly. And so now we go on to our next step, which is remembrance and mourning. Now, this is a very important part of trauma healing, right? This is the part where we process the trauma, we grieve the losses, right? And oftentimes when we think of grief, we think of the loss of a person, right? But in trauma, there are many losses. There's a loss of safety, a loss of trust in the world, right? A loss of a belief, that I thought the world worked a certain way, but it doesn't, you know? And remembrance and mourning really also includes understanding how the trauma has impacted you, right? How it has changed you, and really going into finding meaning and purpose. And this is the key, as we segue on to deeper healing, when we process the trauma, is really looking at um, the meaning and purpose for what this trauma means in our life. And oftentimes that question of why is one of the most debilitating questions, right? Why did this happen? Why? Why did this happen to me? And sometimes we don't have an answer, right? But nevertheless, we can work to find meaning and purpose. One good example of that is, I know there was one trauma survivor, and she had gone through a very, very terrible series of lifetime traumas. And, you know, she, during the healing process, right, the question of why couldn't even be touched, right? Because it made her so mad, right? Why? I don't know why, but I'm dealing with this. And eventually, right, once we passed through stabilization, she started saying, if I hadn't had this trauma, I wouldn't have been able to help so many other people. If I hadn't had this trauma, I would have never been able to find God, right? And so part of that process of remembrance and mourning is, you know, processing the trauma and finding, what this trauma can bring to our life, right? And one of my mentors, Brother Kamal Sharawi, has actually mentioned to me that, there's many people that live in this world. They live their entire lives and they go to their graves without having reflected, right? They go to their graves without having turned back and looked at what life means, right? And so many of us who go through trauma, right, we find that one of the biggest things we gain is depth and meaning, right? And gratitude, such that we would have never had unless we had been through such a terrible, terrible experience or series of experiences. Now, the last phase of trauma recovery is reconnection and integration. And what this phase is really separating ourselves from the trauma such that it no longer defines us or leads our life, right? So it's this creating a new sense of self, a new future ahead, right? Kind of building a new normal. And this is really taking steps towards empowerment and self-determined living, right? And that is In the beginning, right, in the stabilization phase, we can't even imagine being empowered. We can't even imagine having control of our life because so much control was taken away from us, right? Trauma leaves us helpless. Trauma leaves us feeling incapable and incapacitated, right? But through that process of remembering the trauma, mourning the trauma, going through it, right? And rebuilding, really, essentially, right? We come towards empowerment. And part of this empowerment process is really, finding that inner strength and focusing on resilience, right? The one of the most beautiful things about trauma and my work in trauma and my own experience is that, we come out stronger, right? You have this resilience and this sense of survival that, man, I went through that. I can go through anything, right? And that is a priceless, priceless feeling and the priceless building of an inner security that we may never have had, right? Or maybe we did have it, and this time it's even stronger, right? Part of reconnection and integration, right, is also reconnection with others. Trauma has this way of separating us from people, making us feel alone, making us feel isolated, right? And so part of that reconnection is reconnecting with ourselves, right, with others, and even with God, right? And I want to mention here the importance of boundaries, right? Oftentimes, trauma shifts our beliefs, it shifts our behaviors, it causes us to behave in certain ways. And one of the ways that we may often behave is we may fall into this pattern of being a victim because of what happened to us, right? And one of the things that I really, really like to focus on, especially with interpersonal trauma, is boundaries, right? So fostering healthy boundaries so that we're saying yes because we want to, not because we feel like we have to, right? We're saying no without guilt. We know who we are and how we want to be treated and what we like, right? And we feel safe to have disagreements with people or express difficult feelings, right? And part of that process is really working to build healthy boundaries with other people, right? Um, and having our own space, right? Something that is mine alone, right? Oftentimes, enmeshment and um, the control extended on us by others, especially with psychological trauma and physical trauma, can be very debilitating and can make us forget a sense of our boundaries, right? And so rebuilding those boundaries. And I really want to also mention healthy control, right? This trauma is all about power and control. And healthy control, right, is where we take responsibility for what we have control over, right? And we don't take responsibility for others or things that are out of our control, right? So that can include, taking responsibility for our own happiness, right? Or not taking responsibility for others, right? So that's part of this kind of reconnection and integration process. Now, if we move forward into an important aspect of healing, this is called post traumatic growth. And there's a beautiful proverb, I think it comes from the Buddhist tradition, that true peace is knowing that in pain are the seedlings of joy. I'm going to say that again. True peace is knowing that in pain are the seedlings of joy. Now, this proverb really touches on post traumatic growth and how this pain and this tribulation leads to this renewal and this growth, and this new sense of being down the line. And post-traumatic growth is really a big concept in trauma research and healing from trauma, right? It's this renewed sense of power, right? It's safety and healthy control, right? In one's own knowing that even if the world can't be there for me, I will be there for myself when no one else can, and I'll do the best I can. And from a spiritual perspective, right, part of this post traumatic growth is reaching a place of submission to the divine, submission to God, right? Um, Submission in a sense where we may tie our camel, right? We'll do what we can for our safety and leaving the rest to God. Now, this is a very difficult process to come to, much easier said than done, right? It will take me 2, 3 minutes to say it, but it may take weeks, to get to a place of really reaching that emotionally, or even years, right? But this is something we can reach, right? Post-traumatic growth, it's a concept because it's real. There's a lot of literature on this, and a lot of truth to this concept, right? And so coming out of trauma with this renewed sense, that I survived before, I can survive again, right? I went through that, I can go through anything, right? And no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay, right? I'm going to make it. And even if I'm not, I know I can heal because I healed this time, right? One of the most beautiful poems that comes to mind is Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. I recommend any trauma survivor to look into her story and to look into that beautiful poem. And here's kind of a little infographic of the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth, right? And part of that includes spirituality, closer relationships, right? A greater appreciation for life, right? A greater appreciation for safety, right? The basics, and really that inner sense of resilience, which all of us have the capacity for, no matter how much we have been through. We all have that capacity for resilience. And the fact that we're even here sitting and listening to this is a testament to your resilience and your steps to heal. Something really beautiful that I wanted to mention briefly is there's this movie called The Shack, and it's a Christian-based movie, and it's beautiful. You can see here in the image, there's a man kind of in a really, kind of outside. It's a really weeded garden, really, really messy, all this dirt. And he's kind of going through the garden of his life. And I don't want to ruin the movie, but he talks about, or their story talks about how he goes through something very difficult, and it's a mess to him. It feels like things can never go back. And towards the end of the movie, there's this beautiful image that I've screenshotted here, um, of this garden of his life. So you see it panned out in the bigger picture, and you see these beautiful gardens coming together. And there he is sitting and planting another portion of his garden, right? It's a beautiful metaphor, and I'd recommend anyone going through a difficult time, going through a tribulation, to watch that movie. And there's a sense in there of God, and the question of why, right, from a spiritual perspective, gets touched upon as well. Now, some basic tips that I wanted to touch upon for healing. Really, if we had to condense it down, I'd say focus on relaxing the nervous system, right? Focus on that rest and digest response. Honor your needs, right? For those of us struggling with past traumas that are no longer with us, turn towards the present moment, right? Let's not re-trigger and re-traumatize ourselves, and let's move forward. Let's break that cycle, right? And we can do so, with the help of a professional, right? A therapist. And we'll talk a little bit about that, right? For those of us who find ourselves constantly thinking about the past, we can't help it. Everything is triggering the past, right? Every step I take is reminding me of what happened in my childhood, or reminding me of what happened in that past relationship, right? It can be really hard to turn towards the present moment, right? But that's my word of advice, turning towards that present moment, which is a safe moment, right? And recognizing that, yes, that happened to me in the past. Yes, I'm bearing witness to it, right? And yet I'm still safe. And yet here I am now, and I survived that. Here I am now, and I have this in my life now, right? And for those going through current traumas, right, this is a reality. I'd say turn towards safe spaces within and without, right? One of the beautiful pieces about trauma and resilience is that with a healing process, especially with the help of a trained professional or somebody who's experienced with trauma, we can really build this inner sense of strength and safety inside of us, right? And outside of us as well, right? Turn towards safe people, right? Maybe try your best to move out of the situation. I know you are trying, right? But turning towards safe people, right? And if it if that's your walk of life, then turning towards God as well, right? And working towards meaning making and rebuilding, right? With trauma, it has this way, again, like I mentioned, flighting or freezing, right? We freeze oftentimes in the trauma, or we're constantly in the cycle of being ruled by it, right? And so I'd say directing our focus to making meaning and rebuilding, thinking of the future, the present and the future. And self care is really important with trauma, right? Some of the areas of self care are emotional, physical, nutritional, right? Taking that daily vitamin or making sure your body's being nourished, right? Intellectual, being intellectually stimulated, social self care, having connections, relationships, spiritual self care. Many times we don't think about this as an essential need, but it really is, right? No matter what walk of life you're from, we all have a need to make meaning of the world. We all have a need to really have alone time, quiet time, reflection time, And many of us who've been through trauma are scared of doing this. And so I'd say maybe even joining with someone who you love or who you feel safe with to explore this part of yourself again, safely. And there's also financial self-care. So this is just one kind of cycle of how we heal. Now, to kind of close it up, we'll talk about outside supports and different ways of healing. So, one of the primary ways of dealing with trauma, especially if you find yourself feeling a lot of the symptoms or emotions and things we mentioned, right, is getting psychotherapy, right? There's trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. There's cognitive processing therapy, which focuses on those core beliefs. There's EMDR, which is really supported by the research, right? And so the first kind of cluster I'm talking about, those are really mind based therapies. They're intellectual and they can be very profound and meaningful and lead to a lot of breakthroughs for a lot of people, right? And then, there's the second cluster, which I would call somatic therapy, right? So there's mind and then there's body. A lot of the approaches I just spoke about don't factor in as much the importance of releasing trauma from the body, right? And so somatic therapy, trained and experiencing this, can be essential for a lot of us, right? Especially when our trauma has been very visceral, right? Or especially when we're finding that we're talking about it and it's not getting better, right? That's a sign to us that it's living in the body, right? So there's somatic experiencing, sensoring awareness, and trauma releasing exercises. So you can Google all this stuff, look it up. These are some really powerful healing tools. Some other healing tools are trauma sensitive yoga. We mentioned that earlier, mindfulness based stress reduction, EFT tapping. There's a lot of YouTube videos. What I would mention with EFT tapping and trauma, try your best to go to a trained practitioner, right? Someone who knows how to work with the trauma and keep you on that infinity continuum so we're not overflooding ourselves. Massage can be good if touch feels safe. Movement, dance, anything that gets your body moving in its natural way, right? We want to reach the rhythm of our body so that it can release these tensions that are inside of us, right? And some other supports I would mention are medication. Okay? Those things can help oftentimes with nightmares, flashbacks, um, hyperarousal, right? Herbs are very, very helpful, and nutrients, right? Nourishing the body so that although we are in that fight or flight mode and healing from it, our body's getting that much needed support to go through this process. Now, last but not least, we're really, really briefly going to touch on supporting a loved one. Now, for those of us who have a loved one who is suffering from a trauma, I want to say that you may feel helpless. You may feel confused, frustrated, at times overwhelmed about what to do and how to help. Now, it's important for you to become familiar with the common effects of trauma, right? As well as that healing process. This will help you better understand your loved one and allow you to reassure them, right? That what they're experiencing is normal and common after a trauma, right? It's natural to experience these symptoms. I'd also mention extending compassion, right? And recognizing that, you know, PTSD and trauma can be a very invisible illness after some time, right? And extending compassion that although it looks like somebody may have control, um, that at a biological level, right, um, a lot of these symptoms feel very out of control, right? I'd also recommend coming to a place of acceptance with the healing process. This can be really hard, right? Because your loved one may want distance from you, right? And Judith Herman puts it very nicely. She said that a person dealing with trauma may waver from leave me alone to I need you really close, and it can be unpredictable, right? So I'd recommend for loved ones to remain that secure base, remain steadfast, and recognizing that this is a symptom of the trauma, and you being there and you being a secure base that's accepting, loving, and patient is actually essential to their healing process. And you have no idea how helpful that can be, how stabilizing that can be. I'd also recommend particularly for sexual trauma, if your partner has experienced that, go at their pace, give them space when they need it, right? They don't want to feel this way, right? And the hardest thing is when you don't have control over how you're feeling and acting, but others think you do, right? That can be very isolating. And it can cause a traumatized person to even further internalize the trauma and the self hate, right? And so I'd say, really withholding blame and giving space and time and patience to that natural healing process. Now, here are some resources. This recording will be saved so you can pause at these slides. These are some good hotlines. There's also some helplines for Muslims. They're open at limited hours, but they're certainly available. And here are some therapy resources, particularly for the Muslim population. There's a lot nationally. Those are some main ones. I particularly highlighted the Bay Area, California there. That's where I'm from. And then those are some great organizations with some awesome online resource. The National Child Trauma Stress Network, trauma-recovery.ca is a wonderful resource. It's from Canada, but I had to put it up here, right? Trauma is universal. They have some great resources. And so last but not least, thank you for remaining with me during this hour. May you be well. May you heal. And there's my contact information if you have any further questions or need help connecting to resources. Thank you and be well. Assalamu alaikum.